In the history of the First World War, casualty figures on the Western Front dominate most accounts, millions dead at the Somme, Verdun, Passchendaele. Yet far from the trenches of Europe, another campaign unfolded in the blistering heat of the Middle East. It was dismissed by some in London as a mere sideshow, yet by its end it would redraw the map of the region and alter the course of the 20th century. How did a war waged among sand dunes, ancient cities, and scattered wells of Palestine and Sinai produce consequences that reached far beyond the battlefield? That is the riddle of the Sinai and Palestine campaign. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the war in late 1914 opened a new front. For centuries, the empire had dominated the lands of the Levant and Arabia, but by 1914 it was a fading power tied to Germany for survival. Its leaders believed that bold action against Britain's empire could revive Ottoman prestige. Their target was one of the world's lifelines, the Suez Canal. If they could seize it, they might sever Britain's route to India, disrupt imperial communications, and shift the balance of the global war. In January 1915, Ottoman troops crossed the barren wastes of Sinai under German guidance, dragging pontoons to bridge the canal. They hoped surprise and the cover of sandstorms might mask their movements. Instead, British and Indian defenders were waiting. Artillery thundered, shattering the fragile pontoons, while naval guns from warships anchored in the canal blasted the assault. Men fell into the water or staggered back across the dunes. The Ottomans withdrew, battered by sandfire and exhaustion. It was the first of several failed thrusts at the canal. The defeat was a sign of things to come. Britain reinforced Egypt, summoning tens of thousands of Indian troops, cavalry and artillery batteries. Among them were units uniquely adapted to the environment, the Imperial Camel Corps men, swaying in long columns across the desert, each beast carrying not only its rider, but ammunition rations and precious water. The British command, recognizing the canal's vulnerability, made Egypt a fortress. Railways were laid across shifting sands, and a great water pipeline was built to carry life-sustaining supplies forward into Sinai. It was an engineering feat as vital as any battle. Meanwhile, the Ottomans regrouped, drawing on German expertise to strengthen their defenses. Kemal Pasha, governor of Syria, and his German advisor Friedrich Kress von Kressenstein eyed the long frontier between Sinai and southern Palestine as the ground where the empire would stand or fall. Both sides knew the desert itself was an enemy, as dangerous as any army soldiers collapsed from thirst. Sandstorms blinded entire battalions and supplies vanished in the dunes. War here was measured not only in bullets but in drops of water. Thus, by 1916, the Sinai had become more than a wasteland. It was a stage on which empire would fight empire, and where the survival of the Ottoman state would hinge on its ability to resist the most powerful navy and one of the largest armies in the world. Few in Europe noticed. Yet for the men trudging beneath the desert sun, or the civilians in Palestine living under war and famine, the struggle was anything but a sideshow. It was a battle for survival, for faith, and for the future of the Middle East itself. The year 1916 brought a turning point. After months of relative quiet, the Ottomans once more moved west across the Sinai Desert, this time in greater strength and with renewed determination. Their goal was not just to harass the British, but to strike at the heart of their defenses around the Suez Canal. Kemal Pasha entrusted the operation to Kress von Kressenstein, who led a mixed Ottoman and German force across the unforgiving sands. For days, the army pushed forward, hauling guns by camels, struggling against thirst, and leaving a trail of men who collapsed from the heat. By the time they reached the fortified British positions near the town of Romani, their troops were weary, but their commanders believed surprise might bring success. The British, however, had prepared carefully. Behind trenches and wire stood the newly organized Egyptian Expeditionary Force, a combination of British regulars, Indian divisions, and the seasoned Anzac mounted troops who had been pulled from the carnage of Gallipoli. These men had learned the value of mobility in desert warfare. On August 3, 1916, as the Ottoman assault fell upon the British line, the defenders held firm. Machine guns cut down attackers who tried to advance across open sand. Artillery from the canal roared into action. When the Ottomans began to falter, the Anzac cavalry mounted a counterattack, circling around the flanks with speed the weary invaders could not match. The Battle of Romani ended in disaster for Kemal Pasha's troops. Casualties were heavy, and worse still, the survivors found themselves retreating through the same wasteland that had drained them on the march out. Pursued by mounted columns, many were captured or killed before reaching safety. For the British, Romani was more than a defensive success. It marked the first major victory against the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. London hailed it as proof that the so-called sideshow could yield results at a time when the Western Front bled without gain. Seizing the moment, the British pressed their advantage. By December 1916, they had driven the Ottomans out of El Arish, a key desert stronghold. Just weeks later, at Rafah, British and mounted troops stormed Ottoman trenches under withering fire, eventually forcing a retreat. In both battles, water dictated the pace of combat. Men carried not just rifles, but extra bottles strapped to their packs, and animals staggered under the weight of barrels lashed to saddles. Logistics became as decisive as courage. These victories pushed the front line from Egypt into the southern approaches of Palestine. For the first time since the war began, the British were no longer merely defending, but carrying the conflict into Ottoman territory. Yet with this advance came new challenges. Southern Palestine was defended by a network of trenches and fortified villages anchored on the Gaza-Beersheba line. Here, Ottoman soldiers, bolstered by German and Austro-Hungarian units, prepared to stand their ground. They knew that if the British broke through, the way to Jerusalem, Damascus, and beyond might lie open. The Desert War had entered a new phase. The Sinai had been conquered, but ahead lay Palestine, a land as ancient as it was contested, and one that both empires were determined to claim. The struggle for its cities and hills would soon prove far bloodier than the battles in the dunes. By early 1917, the British advance had reached the gates of Palestine, and the focus shifted to Gaza, a fortified city guarding the coastal road to the north. Here, the Ottomans had constructed defensive lines of trenches, barbed wire, and strongpoints supported by German advisors and artillery. For the British command in Cairo, the conquest of Gaza promised not only control of southern Palestine, but also a symbolic victory to offset the stalemate in Europe. The stage was set for what would become one of the most frustrating episodes of the campaign. On March 26, 1917, the First Battle of Gaza began. General Archibald Murray, leading the Egyptian Expeditionary Force, aimed for a swift capture before Ottoman reinforcements could arrive. British cavalry and Anzac mounted troops galloped through the dust encircling parts of the city and even breaking into its outskirts. Infantry pressed forward under the harsh desert sun, advancing through fields of cactus hedges and tangled scrub that concealed Ottoman machine gun nests. In places, bayonet charges drove defenders from their trenches, and some units believed victory was at hand. Yet confusion soon gripped the battlefield. A heavy fog in the morning had delayed artillery support, communications broke down, and supply lines faltered as men ran short of water. Fearful of being cut off by Ottoman reinforcements, Murray ordered a retreat, just as his troops were on the verge of success. The withdrawal stunned the men who had fought their way into the enemy's defenses. For the Ottomans, it was a defensive triumph. They had inflicted nearly 4,000 casualties, while losing only about a third of that number. The defenders under Kress von Kressenstein had proved that even in the desert they could withstand the British onslaught. Undeterred, Murray prepared for a second attempt. On April 17, 1917, the British launched another offensive, the Second Battle of Gaza. This time they brought heavy artillery, naval bombardment, and even a handful of Mark I tanks to smash through the fortified lines. But the tanks, unsuited to the sandy soil and vulnerable to well-aimed Ottoman gunners, were quickly disabled. British infantry advanced across open ground into storms of rifle and machine gun fire, with casualties mounting by the minute. For the Ottoman soldiers defending behind trenches, dug into the dry earth, the sight of British warships bombarding from offshore and tanks lumbering forward was daunting. Yet they held firm, firing until their barrels overheated. The result was another British disaster, 6,500 casualties compared to roughly 2,000 on the Ottoman side. Once again, the defenders had prevailed. The two failed assaults on Gaza had enormous consequences. In London, frustration with Murray's leadership grew. Critics called Gaza a graveyard of British plans, and the campaign seemed to confirm fears that resources were being wasted on a sideshow far from the decisive front in France. Morale among the troops sagged as months of harsh desert marches and fruitless attacks seemed to promise only more blood without victory. Still beneath the disappointment, changes were brewing. In Cairo, the High Command debated whether to abandon the campaign altogether. Instead, a decision was made that would alter the course of the war. In Palestine, Murray would be replaced by a new commander, one with a reputation for energy and determination. His name was Edmund Allenby. In the summer of 1917, General Edmund Allenby took command of the Egyptian Expeditionary Force. A tall, imposing figure with a reputation for directness, Allenby was given a clear mandate by Prime Minister David Lloyd George: capture Jerusalem by Christmas. For a war-weary Britain, such a prize would carry immense symbolic weight, offering hope at a time when the Western Front consumed men by the thousands with little gain. Allenby's arrival marked not just a change in leadership, but a transformation in how the Desert War would be fought. He began by reorganizing the exhausted army he inherited. Morale was restored with better supplies, improved medical care, and a more personal style of leadership. Allenby was known to tour the front lines on horseback, speaking directly to soldiers. Crucially, he understood that success in Palestine depended not only on courage but on logistics. Under his direction, engineers extended the railway farther into the desert, while pipelines ensured a steady flow of water to the front. Cavalry units, including the desert-mounted corps of Australians, New Zealanders, and yeomanry, were retrained and prepared for the kind of sweeping maneuvers that static trench warfare in Europe could no longer provide. At the same time, new weapons arrived to strengthen British arms. Air squadrons equipped with Bristol fighters gained the upper hand in the skies, contesting German and Ottoman reconnaissance planes that had previously dominated. With aerial photography and bombing raids, Allenby's forces could now disrupt enemy supply lines and mask their own movements. It was a war where the roar of engines in the sky joined the tramp of camels and the thunder of hooves on the sand. The Ottomans, meanwhile, were reeling from internal disputes. Enver Pasha had placed the German general Erich von Falkenhayn in overall command of the Yildirim army group intended to restore the initiative in Palestine. But his arrival sparked tensions with Ottoman officers, most notably Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, who criticized the empire's reliance on German direction and warned of disaster if the war dragged on. Kemal's reports painted a grim picture of famine, corruption, and an army stretched to the breaking point. Yet, despite these warnings, the Ottoman command remained divided, struggling to coordinate its defense of Palestine. Beyond the front lines, the political stakes were rising. In November 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. At the same time, Britain had promised Arab leaders independence if they rose against Ottoman rule, and had already signed the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement with France to divide the region. These overlapping pledges revealed a deep contradiction at the heart of Allied policy. While soldiers fought in the sands of Gaza and Beersheba, diplomats were laying the foundations of conflicts that would long outlast the war. For Allenby, however, the immediate task was clear: to break the stalemate at Gaza. Twice already, British assaults had failed with heavy loss. A third attempt would need to be different, swift, decisive, and above all, built around the mastery of logistics and deception. The key to his plan lay in a dusty frontier town to the east, known for its ancient wells. That place was Beersheba. On the edge of the desert, where the sands gave way to rocky scrub and scattered wells, stood the town of Beersheba. It was little more than a cluster of stone houses and watering points. Yet, in the autumn of 1917, it became the pivot of Allenby's strategy. For the British, Beersheba meant water, the lifeblood of armies moving across the arid land. For the Ottomans, it was the eastern anchor of the formidable Gaza-Beersheba defensive line. To break the stalemate, Allenby would strike here first in a maneuver designed to surprise an enemy, convinced Gaza remained the main objective. On October 31st, the plan unfolded. British artillery and warships thundered against Gaza in a noisy demonstration, convincing Ottoman commanders that another frontal assault was underway. Meanwhile, in the east, columns of British Indian and Anzac troops converged on Beersheba. Among them rode the Australian light horse, seasoned in desert fighting and uniquely prepared for rapid movement. As dawn broke, dust clouds rose on the horizon and the battle began. Initial infantry assaults cleared Ottoman outposts, but time was short. Without capturing the wells by nightfall, the cavalry and horses would face crippling thirst. In the late afternoon, Allenby gave the order for a bold gamble. The 4th and 12th Australian Light Horse Regiments drew sabres and spurred their mounts forward. Across nearly 2 miles of open ground, they galloped, shells exploding around them, machine guns hammering from the trenches ahead. Yet speed and shock carried them through. Horses leapt over Turkish trenches, riders firing revolvers at close range, bayonets flashing as they dismounted to sweep the defenders aside. By evening, Beersheba was in British hands, its wells secured. The charge was one of the last great cavalry assaults in modern warfare, etched into memory by its sheer audacity. To the Ottomans, it was a devastating blow. Their defensive line, thought secure, had been cracked at its weakest point. To the British, it was a triumph of maneuver over attrition, proof that mobility and deception could succeed where brute force had failed. The victory at Beersheba unlocked the Gaza front. Within days, Allenby pressed his advantage, launching the main assault against Gaza on November 6th. This time, with the Ottoman flank compromised, the defenders could not hold. British-led forces stormed the trenches, forcing Kress von Kressenstein to order a retreat. The Ottoman line collapsed, and soon after Jaffa fell into Allied hands with little resistance. Yet even in success, the hardships of desert war lingered. Soldiers spoke of thirst so fierce that men fought with swollen tongues and blistered lips. Horses collapsed by the dozens from exhaustion, their carcasses scattered along the advance. The sand, the sun, and the endless distances were as much an enemy as the Ottoman rifle. But Gaza was at last conquered, and the way to Jerusalem stood open. The campaign had shifted. What began as a defensive struggle for the Suez Canal was now an offensive drive into the heart of Palestine. The British had not only secured their imperial lifeline, but were about to seize one of the most contested and symbolically charged cities in the world. With Gaza fallen and Beersheba secured, Allenby turned his gaze toward a prize that loomed larger than any battlefield objective: Jerusalem. To capture the holy city would be to claim a victory rich in symbolism, a triumph that would echo across the Allied world. Prime Minister Lloyd George had spoken openly of receiving Jerusalem as a Christmas present, a remark that revealed how deeply political aims were entwined with the campaign. For Allenby, though, the task was daunting. The road to Jerusalem ran through the rugged Judean hills, where narrow tracks wound upward through valleys, villages, and ridges, ideally suited for defense. In late November 1917, British and Dominion forces began their advance into the hills. The fighting was fierce and often hand-to-hand. Ottoman soldiers, though outnumbered, used the terrain skillfully, holding stone terraces and rocky slopes with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. Rain turned the paths to mud-slowing movement and bogging down artillery. Supplies were hauled by mule or camel, and men often marched through nights of freezing wind after days of blistering sun. Letters and diaries from soldiers describe exhaustion so complete that men fell asleep in the mud under fire, only to be roused by comrades to continue climbing. Allenby, aware of Jerusalem's sacred status for Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike, took steps to avoid damage to its holy places. He declared a no-combat zone around the city itself, determined that the fighting should not scar its walls and shrines. On December 8th, Ottoman forces withdrew rather than risk encirclement, leaving Jerusalem exposed. 2 days later, Allenby entered the city, not on horseback like the Kaiser before him, but on foot through the Jaffa Gate. It was a calculated gesture of humility meant to show respect for the city's sanctity and to distinguish Britain's conquest from medieval crusades. The reactions were immediate and far-reaching. In Allied capitals, church bells rang, newspapers hailed the liberation of the Holy City, and morale lifted after months of grim news from Europe. In London, the event was cast in near-biblical terms. In the city itself, the response was more complex. Jewish residents greeted the British with cautious hope, Christians with a mix of relief and anxiety, and Muslims with deep unease at the loss of yet another sacred city of Islam after Mecca and Baghdad. For Ottoman officers, news of Jerusalem's fall was devastating. One recalled that the announcement spread like a death notice, a sign that the empire's grip on the Levant was unraveling. Though Jerusalem fell with relatively little bloodshed, the victory was not purely symbolic. It marked the collapse of the Ottoman defensive line in southern Palestine, opening the way for further British advances into the interior. Yet the struggle was far from over. The winter rains set in soaking trenches and collapsing supply roads. Both sides paused to regroup. For the men who had fought their way through the Judean hills, the capture of Jerusalem was a moment of pride, but also a reminder of how much suffering lay ahead before the Ottoman Empire could be broken. The winter of 1917-1918 brought a lull to the Palestine front, but it was far from peaceful. Rain turned the hills and valleys into quagmires, bogging down guns and wagons. Soldiers huddled in drenched uniforms, their boots caked in mud, fighting cold and disease rather than Ottoman rifle fire. Allenby used the pause to consolidate his gains, pushing forward the railway line and extending pipelines to sustain his forces deep in enemy territory. Supplies of food fodder and above all water remained decisive. Without them, no army could survive in the harsh terrain. For the Ottomans, the respite was an opportunity to reorganize. In late 1917, the Yildirim or Lightning Army Group was reinforced under German guidance, commanded first by Falkenhayn and later by Lyman von Sanders. Their task was formidable: defend a shrinking front with dwindling manpower, while morale at home crumbled under famine, corruption, and war weariness. Mustafa Kemal, commanding part of the Ottoman Seventh Army, continued to clash with his superiors, warning that the empire was decaying from within. He spoke of bribery, profiteering, and a population losing faith in a government unable to feed its own people. His words captured the crisis of an empire stretched to breaking. Meanwhile, the Arab revolt pressed from the flanks, led by Sharif Hussein's sons and supported by British golden advisors like T. Lawrence. Arab irregulars harassed Ottoman garrisons, sabotaged railways, and tied down troops who might otherwise have reinforced the Palestine front. The dramatic capture of Aqaba in July 1917 had given the revolt a base on the Red Sea, and from there Bedouin fighters fanned into the desert, undermining Ottoman control of the Hejaz and threatening the lifelines northward. The war in the skies also intensified. British and Australian squadrons, now better equipped with Bristol fighters, regained superiority over Ottoman and German planes. Aerial reconnaissance provided Allenby with vital intelligence, while bombing raids struck at Ottoman depots and troop movements. The air war was not only about firepower, it was about vision, the ability to see across the desert, to anticipate where the enemy might move, and to mask one's own intentions. Yet, for all Allenby's preparations, events in Europe dictated the tempo. In March 1918, Germany launched its Great Spring Offensive on the Western Front. The desperate need for reinforcements forced Britain to transfer some of Allenby's divisions from Palestine back to France. For months, the prospect of a decisive blow in the Middle East slipped away, as Allenby found himself with fewer men to hold an extended line. Only local raids such as skirmishes near Jericho and Ammon broke the quiet. But by summer, the tide turned. The German offensive in France had failed, and reinforcements began to flow east once more. Allenby rebuilt his army, mustering nearly 80,000 men to face barely half that number of Ottomans. Railways, pipelines, and depots were stocked for one last effort. The lull had served its purpose. Ahead lay a final offensive designed not just to capture ground, but to annihilate the Ottoman armies in Palestine. That offensive would unfold at a place whose name carried echoes of biblical prophecy, Megiddo. By September 1918, Allenby was ready to strike. His plan for the Battle of Megiddo was a masterpiece of deception and mobility, combining modern firepower with the age-old speed of cavalry. He massed the bulk of his infantry opposite the coastal plain near Gaza, convincing the Ottomans that another frontal assault was imminent. To sell the ruse, supply dumps were built in plain sight, troop movements staged for aerial observers, and dummy camps lit with fires at night. Meanwhile, in secret, Allenby concentrated his cavalry and elite infantry for a breakthrough on the narrow coastal corridor, where the terrain allowed for rapid exploitation once the line was pierced. At dawn on September 19th, a massive artillery barrage shattered Ottoman trenches along the coastal front. British, Indian, and Australian infantry surged forward, breaking through with surprising speed. Within hours, mounted divisions poured through the gap, riding north in a whirlwind of dust and steel. Airplanes roared overhead, not only strafing retreating columns but bombing the few choke points, the bridges and passes, that might have allowed the Ottomans to regroup. By nightfall, the Allied cavalry had advanced nearly 40 kilometers, cutting the vital north-south roads. The effect was catastrophic. Entire Ottoman divisions found themselves encircled, their lines of communication severed, retreat turned into rout as men abandoned guns and wagons, fleeing across the hills under constant harassment from the sky. Lawrence and Arab fighters joined the pursuit, seizing rail junctions and towns to the east, choking off further escape. Within a week, what had begun as a carefully orchestrated assault had collapsed into the disintegration of the Ottoman field army in Palestine. Out of more than 30,000 defenders, only a fraction managed to escape capture or death. Ottoman survivors spoke of chaos, men scattering across wadis, without officers' units dissolving under relentless bombing, and hunger and thirst breaking discipline faster than any bullet. British pilots described roads clogged with abandoned carts and corpses of men and animals alike, scenes more reminiscent of medieval routes than modern war. For the Allies, Megiddo was not just a battle won, but an enemy destroyed. The road now lay open into Syria. Cavalry raced ahead, reaching Nazareth and beyond. Damascus, once the beating heart of Ottoman Syria, was suddenly within reach. For an empire that had ruled the Levant for centuries, the loss of Palestine and the shattering of its armies signaled not just a setback but the beginning of collapse. The pursuit that followed Megiddo was relentless. Allied cavalry swept north through the coastal plain, while Arab irregulars struck from the desert, blocking railways and ambushing fleeing columns. Ottoman soldiers, exhausted and demoralized, abandoned weapons in heaps along the roadside. British and Australian air squadrons bombed retreating columns caught in narrow passes, turning roads into killing grounds. Survivors stumbled through dust and fire, pursued without pause. On October 1, 1918, British and Arab forces entered Damascus. The city, once the proud capital of the Umayyad Caliphate and a jewel of the Ottoman realm, now saw Allied troops march through its streets. For the Hashemite forces under Emir Faisal, accompanied by Lawrence of Arabia, it was a moment of triumph. Damascus symbolized the promise of an Arab kingdom rising from Ottoman ruins, though already British and French agreements hinted that those promises would not be honored. Still, for the fighters who had endured years in the desert, the fall of Damascus was a vision of liberation. The collapse of Ottoman power spread quickly. Aleppo fell within weeks, and Ottoman commanders could no longer rally effective resistance. The empire that had once stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Danube was shrinking to its Anatolian core. Soldiers and civilians alike spoke of an empire dissolving before their eyes. Fali Rıfkı Atay, an Ottoman officer, later recalled the grief in headquarters as news of one city after another was lost. It felt, he said, like a death announcement, the farewell to an empire's centuries-old dominion. The devastation extended beyond the battlefield. In the Levant, years of war and blockade had produced famine. Villages lay hollowed by hunger fields untended, and families uprooted. For civilians in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, the British advance meant both an end to Ottoman requisitions and the arrival of new masters. Relief mingled with uncertainty about what rule would follow. In Jerusalem, Damascus, and Aleppo, religious leaders prayed for peace, while ordinary people feared that one empire's fall might bring not freedom but new struggles. The pace of events was staggering. What had begun as a defensive war to protect the Suez Canal in 1915 had, by late 1918, become a cascade of Allied victories stretching deep into the Ottoman heartland. For Britain, the campaign brought a strategic windfall. The empire secured not only its lifelines to India, but also vast new territories in the Middle East. For the Ottomans, defeat meant not only the loss of land, but the unraveling of imperial identity. And yet, even as Damascus fell and Aleppo awaited its fate, the war was not over. The Allies pressed for final terms, and Ottoman leaders faced the most difficult decision of all, whether to fight on in the shadow of inevitable defeat or seek peace before Constantinople itself was threatened. By October 1918, the Ottoman leadership knew the end had come. The empire's armies in Palestine and Syria were shattered, its railways cut, its cities occupied. The Allied cavalry pressed north. Arab detachments moved through the desert with Growing confidence and British warships threatened the coasts. In Constantinople, ministers debated how to save what remained of a centuries-old state. Enver Pasha, once the architect of Ottoman war aims, was now cornered by reality. The empire could not withstand another campaign. On October 30, 1918, aboard the British warship Agamemnon anchored in Mudros harbor, representatives of the Ottoman government signed an armistice. The terms were harsh. Allied forces were given the right to occupy forts controlling the straits, to station troops wherever they deemed necessary, and to control Ottoman railways, ports, and garrisons. In effect, the empire surrendered its sovereignty even before a peace treaty was drafted. For ordinary Ottoman soldiers scattered across the front, the armistice meant laying down arms and facing the humiliation of captivity. For civilians, it meant the lifting of wartime restrictions, but also the looming uncertainty of foreign occupation. The Armistice of Mudros did not just end fighting in the Middle East. It signaled the collapse of the Ottoman Empire itself. What remained of its authority would soon be dismantled by the victorious Allies, divided by agreements made in secret, even before the guns fell silent. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Balfour Declaration, and Britain's pledges to the Arabs all collided in the post-war settlements. Palestine would be placed under a British mandate, Syria under French control, and the dream of an independent Arab kingdom was quickly curtailed. For Britain, the campaign was remembered as a triumph, a strategic victory that secured the Suez Canal, opened the route to India, and delivered the symbolic prize of Jerusalem. Allenby was celebrated as the general who had turned a stagnant front into a decisive theater. Yet behind the rhetoric of victory lay contradictions that would haunt the region for generations. The promises made to Arabs, Jews, and European allies could not all be kept. Britain had in effect pledged the same land to three different causes. The legacy of the Sinai and Palestine campaign was thus twofold. Militarily, it marked the destruction of Ottoman power in the Levant and helped hasten the Central Powers' defeat in the Great War. Politically, it sowed the seeds of future conflicts by reshaping the Middle East through imperial ambition and overlapping promises. What had begun in 1915 as an Ottoman bid to seize the Suez Canal ended in 1918 with the empire itself dissolved. The Desert War, dismissed by some as a sideshow, had, in truth, redrawn borders, toppled dynasties, and set in motion disputes that endure to this day. In the quiet aftermath of Mudros, as Allied troops occupied Ottoman ports and Arab leaders debated the future of their lands, one fact was clear: the Middle East would never be the same again. The armistice ended the fighting, but it did not end the consequences. In many ways, the aftermath of the Sinai and Palestine campaign proved more decisive than the battles themselves. The war had stripped the Ottoman Empire of its Arab provinces, and Britain and France quickly moved to secure their claims. Under the League of Nations mandates, Britain assumed control of Palestine, while France established its authority over Syria and Lebanon. These were presented as international trusteeships, but in reality they extended imperial rule under a new name. For the Arabs who had fought alongside the British, the result was disillusionment. Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his sons, who had raised the banner of revolt with the promise of independence, found themselves marginalized as European diplomats carved up the region. Damascus, where Faisal briefly declared an Arab government, soon fell under French control. The dream of a unified Arab kingdom proved fleeting, replaced by the harsh reality of colonial mandates. At the same time, the Balfour Declaration began to reshape Palestine. Britain's support for a national home for the Jewish people encouraged waves of migration and settlement in the years that followed. For Jewish communities worldwide, this promise seemed to herald a long-awaited return. For the Arab majority already living in Palestine, it raised fears of displacement and dispossession. The seeds of a conflict that would dominate the 20th century were sown in the very months that Allenby's troops marched into Jerusalem. For the people of the Levant, the campaign left deep scars. Beyond the shifting flags of empire war had brought famine epidemics and displacement. In Mount Lebanon, hundreds of thousands perished during the wartime famine, victims of blockade and requisition. In Palestine and Syria, families who had endured years of Ottoman conscription and scarcity now faced new administrations with their own demands. The collapse of Ottoman authority created a vacuum filled not by peace but by Competing visions, imperial control, nationalist aspirations, and religious claims layered upon one another. Even among the victors, debate lingered. Some British politicians argued that the Middle Eastern theatre had drained resources from the Western Front, delaying victory in Europe. Others insisted that it had preserved Britain's empire by securing the Suez Canal and oil supplies. Allenby himself received honors for his campaign, remembered for humility in Jerusalem and brilliance at Megiddo. Yet his victories could not untangle the contradictions left by policy. Thus, the Sinai and Palestine campaign was more than a desert war. It was a crucible in which military strategy, imperial ambition, and nationalist hopes collided. It destroyed the last great Muslim empire of the early modern world, while setting the stage for new conflicts that would dominate the modern Middle East. Soldiers who had marched under burning skies could not have known that their struggle would echo far beyond 1918, shaping borders, identities, and disputes for a century to come. The story of the Sinai and Palestine campaign closes not with silence, but with echoes that still reverberate today. What began as an Ottoman gamble to seize the Suez Canal became a chain of events that redrew the map of the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, once the great bridge between continents, dissolved into fragments, leaving its former provinces divided among new rulers. The deserts that had seen cavalry charges and camel caravans now lay beneath the flags of Britain and France, their future shaped by treaties drafted far away in European capitals. For the soldiers who fought there, the memories endured long after the war. Anzac troopers remembered the thunder of hooves at Beersheba as proof that cavalry still had a place in modern battle. Indian infantry recalled the endless marches across Sinai, their packs heavy with ammunition and extra water bottles, their endurance tested as much by thirst as by bullets. Ottoman veterans, many of them Anatolian peasants far from home, carried the bitterness of retreat and the grief of empire's collapse. Diaries from officers and letters from ordinary men reveal the same refrain that the desert fought them as fiercely as any enemy. Yet, beyond the armies, it was the civilians who bore the heaviest burden. In Palestine, Syria and Lebanon, war meant hunger, disease, and upheaval. The famine in Mount Lebanon took more lives than some of the battles. Refugees streamed through ruined towns while families bartered possessions for bread. When the British entered Jerusalem, some communities hoped for relief, others for justice, but all faced uncertainty. Within a few short years, those uncertainties hardened into rival nationalisms, Arab, Jewish, and colonial, that clashed over the same sacred soil. The campaign's legacy is paradoxical. Militarily, it was one of the most decisive Allied victories of the Great War. A complete destruction of Ottoman field armies, the capture of Jerusalem and Damascus, the opening of the road to Constantinople. Politically, it was a tangle of contradictions, promises made to Arabs, to Zionists, and to European allies that could not all be kept. Spiritually, it was a moment that resonated across faiths: the fall of a holy city, the entrance of foreign troops, and the reframing of sacred geography in the age of modern war. In the words of Lloyd George, Britain owed much to its sideshows. He could not have known just how right he was, for the Sinai and Palestine campaign was no sideshow. It was a fulcrum, a turning point where desert battles and imperial promises reshaped the fate of millions. Its cavalry charges and trench assaults belonged to the First World War, but its consequences belong to the century that followed, and to the conflicts that endure even now.